Hello class, today we're starting our section on arguments and persuasion. Even if you work through this lecture, I highly recommend you read up on the chapters to supplement your knowledge. I'm going to focus on considerations that are extraneous to what's presented in the books. But as the title slide says, arguments and persuasion, persuasion is not convincing someone necessarily. Arguments are not just a shouting match, but our own natural human tendencies might make us feel this way, and so we have to receive training to understand how to do this more effectively, and we definitely need to then make an effort to ensure our writing is more appropriate to this task. That being said, you know more than you realize, and so we're just going to get to that. In keeping up with a concept that we've already introduced to you, argument and persuasion in casual conversation may be synonyms and interchangeable, and certainly for the sake of assigning the papers, I use them like that, but you need to understand the difference between the terms so that you can be more effective at utilizing them. Argument is when you seek or clarify the truth. You're hopefully arguing what you think is true. However, others may be misguided, misled, or not have a complete picture, and so in that case, you're trying to make it clear for them. You don't seek to change minds or browbeat anyone. Your goal should be then, and so this lines up appropriately for the class, should be to present your position as valid. Doing so, people disagree with you, probably still be upset because you've challenged their point of views and perspectives. But after they get over that, they'll come back and reconsider your points, and if you are truly right and correct, they'll come along. Think about why we believe what we believe. It's because usually what we have to, how we've been raised, and these are important to us, and being subjected to wrongness, it's not a word, but just so you can know, is an unpleasant experience to say the least. However, it's necessary to subject ourselves to that so that we can approach being right. Persuasion is determining the best course of action, and you notice best is in quotation marks. If there was only the best thing to do, there would be no argument made. We would just do that. But we never have unlimited resources, time, assistance, anything. Sometimes we have to compromise with what's achievable, what's practical, what's affordable, all these things. And so when I say best, that's what I mean. Sometimes you still won't really make people satisfied with that. I bring these up because an argument essay, maybe there's multiple explanations for a situation and that can guide your paragraphs and whatnot, but more likely you'll have to look at it from different perspectives, medical, psychological, historical, sociological, something like that. Same approach you can take with a research paper. Persuasive types of essays, you can certainly though work through each of the options and explain why one makes more or less sense, why we definitely don't want to do one, and so use that guidance for putting together your essay. There's just a few more concepts right here. Sophism is arguing to win, utilizing the techniques you learn in the presentation and construction of arguments merely to argue for the exercise. This is somewhat what we have in our adversarial legal system, where the persecution always argues that the other side is guilty and the defense always argues that they are not guilty. Of course, we must be mindful and talk about manipulation. That is any efforts at intimidation, deception, or whatever you can do to get people to do what's best for you and not necessarily best for them. You should avoid that. You can further delineate arguments by classifying them. We have a list here, and the approach to these types of arguments are different. Now think of the analogy to, a rectangle is a four-sided object, a square is a four-sided object with equal sides. All rectangles are not squares, but all squares are rectangles. So these are all arguments, but they're not all necessarily proposals. If you're not clear of something that's being done or that's happened, and then you need to reconstruct the events like you would, say, a court case, a trial, these are arguments of facts. It's not a matter necessarily that you're speculating what really happened. It's just that we don't have a complete picture unless, you know, we have full audio recording and videotape. And even then, the motivations and ideas behind it might be suspect. Definitions are when we examine the nature of a topic, a position, a stance. You know, when you argue if something truly qualifies as like a true insert political stance here. Evaluation is when we, you know, consider the value, the quality of something. A lot of then awards are given not based on something being the best, even if that's in the title, but, you know, the components of such things. A movie, if it's good, has a number of factors into it: acting, directing, cinematography, of course the story. So many things that could go wrong or right to line up to make it great. Sometimes you just like the action, but the thing is a little silly. Anything has components, and if you examine these components, how they work together, you have an evaluation. Causality is kind of like a little bit evaluation and a little bit fact. You look at, you know, if something has caused something else, and it's not always clear. There's three concepts which you need to be aware of: causality, correlation, and coincidence. Causality, again, there's a provable, linkable connection between events and whatnot. Correlation is they happen, they're related, but do they actually link and cause each other to happen? Maybe not. And coincidence, just randomness. Of course, proposals is then perhaps another synonym for persuasion. You know, what should we do in a situation? Of course, we have to consider a number of other concepts when discussing arguments. A fact is a verifiable, provable statement. Now, there then exist unproven, unverified facts, but their utility in argument is limited. We also then have opinions, concepts which will never be proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. These include matters of tastes. These include speculation or guess. And a lot of people consider then their opinion because they hold it as proof and verification of that position. Statements lacking verification are ostensibly opinions and relatively useless for arguments. Or rather, if someone has to like you if they accept your opinion, and that takes us to the notion of bias. Bias is preconceived notions, or what you get out of the argument by winning or being correct beyond being right. If there's some benefit from someone doing what you'd want them to do besides the best thing being done, that's bias. If you like someone, you probably are positively disposed towards the points they make. It shouldn't be a factor in things, but it's always a factor and must be considered. You need to be able to identify bias and also strive to limit your own presentation of bias in your argument, because it becomes something that can work against you. Null hypothesis is the notion that just because someone doesn't prove you wrong, you're right, or vice versa. You can't say you don't know, or you can't say I'm wrong and I can't say you're right. Well, if you're making a stronger claim, I think it's incumbent on you as the arguer to offer the evidence. Some indicators of bias might be inflammatory or slanted language. If someone uses what could be dubbed as politically incorrect terminology in the subject or topic, or in reference to other individuals or groups, it's a good sign they don't like those groups, and then you need to be suspicious of them, because they're saying they're giving away their position. And are they using that because of a lack of character or moral fiber, or more frequently, you know, rather than actually argue main points, they're trying to, you know, speak to already, you know, people's biases. They're trying to tell it like it is. And, well, that's certainly not academic, and it's, you know, a bad part of life. You don't want to be putting badness out there. Certainly in your own essays, it's a sign, you know, that you're listening to the wrong types of experts or individuals. It's not a matter of, you know, being technically correct. You know, most stereotypes, which are also indicators of bias, are not true anymore of a specific group than they are most people randomly, and it's just not enough. It's not a sign of anything but your own problems. So what I've laid out here is a very basic argument structure. Now, first of all, if you're doing a shorter answer or shorter response for a test or something, this might be an appropriate way to do it, you know, one sentence, one sentence, one sentence. But really you want to consider, you know, which of these are pretty straightforward, clear statements, like one sentence, and which are, you know, things that you might need to elaborate upon, go on for, you know, paragraphs even. But anyway, a claim is your point to be argued. Now in the argument itself, this can include your thesis or your topic sentences, either your main point or some of the reasons or subtopics that you're going to be dealing with. Lacking anything else, this is more of an opinion statement, and a lot of people present their opinions or assumptions and then they just reword them or reiterate them and think they've made an argument. Or they might introduce other points that are building off the initial claims. You want to avoid doing this. Grounds are supporting facts, figures, research, expert opinion, experience, stories. There's too many to name. But you want to be careful. You know, again, you're not just making an argument if you give a list of information, nor is an argument merely saying what you think and then saying reason why without further explaining yourself. Think of data versus information. I'm sorry, data versus evidence. Data is information. Evidence is data that you use to make an argument. So how do you handle your data and turn it into evidence? Well, avoid thinking that the facts speak for themselves, because they don't. People can jump to the wrong conclusions when you lay out pieces of evidence. An argument is a guided thought process. You know, you're saying, hey, think of this, and then that's happening because of these things, and so if we do this like these other people did, we'll deal with it. So your claim and your grounds, that's not the majority of your essay. A claim is a few sentences at most per page. Grounds, maybe you're just dropping in a few, you know, statements, a few clauses, a few numbers even. Or maybe you're using a lengthier bit of argument that or a lengthier piece of evidence that you have to explain for a paragraph or so. So your whole essay, the majority of it, should not be those sentences and that information. You are talking about that information and putting your own spin on it. So that leads you to then the main component of an argument, your warrants, which are where you connect the claim and the grounds. You know, these are the conclusions you want your reader to reach from the evidence. Now, each manner of evidence has problems, and you need to deal with these problems. Experience, well, two people can go through the same thing and have different experiences, and it's not a matter of who's right. It's a matter, more appropriately, of, you know, what's more applicable. Who's going to have the more frequent experience, and how can you show that? If you're talking with an expert, why do we want to hear what this expert has to say? If you're dealing with an expert who's right about a lot of things, but he has a few glaring weaknesses or personal problems or whatever, you need to then consider that information and how your audience will take it when you're using that bit of evidence. It doesn't prove him wrong, but it might be something you have to consider. Lastly, you might have some kind of conclusion statement, little conclusion, not like at the end of your essay. In that case, that's just a claim that comes towards the end of your paragraph, or after you've been laying out your evidence and explaining yourself and why those matter. You can build to your to one of your smaller claims and say, well, think about this, and now there's this other thing, and you know, all that makes sense because whatever, and because of all that, we should know whatever. So because it's such a central part of your argument, I wanted to list a number of possibilities for warrants. If you want to take on, admit to, or excuse the bias of your sources, that's fine. You might examine the motivations of why the researchers or whoever you're gathering from are reporting or trying to figure out the information, because that will have some bearing on then if you use their information for your own points. If there are limitations or exceptions to the evidence you bring up, you don't want to be caught with your pants down if someone who's disputing your points tries to argue with you, so you'll want to face those head on. You can hopefully use good evidence for everything, but if your argument is more of an attack on other people's points or the quality of their own evidence, you can explain the limitations of other perspectives, grounds. You know, but ultimately you're talking about why do you bring up this information over all other information. Usually you can find a lot of evidence on one side or the other, and usually you have to fight your own desires for confirmation bias to then say, well, this makes me look good, this helps me out, so it must be right. Again, if you want to explain, you know, how your evidence is common or typical, your experiences is applicable to the masses instead of just a few specific groups, that might be something you might use for a warrant. And again, if things that prove you wrong or ways that people can jump to the wrong conclusions from your evidence, that would be useful to then explain before your reader starts coming up with those ideas themselves.